Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of science journalism here at New York University and the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops. And we're here for our third of 4 Kavli conversations this spring. We're very grateful to Naseem Miller and Haelle for coming. But I will leave their formal introductions to our host tonight, the amazing Robin Lloyd, who is a visiting scholar here at the Institute, longtime faculty member, the president of the Council on American Science Writing. Have I got that right? I think I do. Close. So with that, I will turn things over to Robin, and we'll get things started.
Great. It's nice to see everyone here. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Naseem and Terry, for being here. And before I introduce you, I just want to set up our conversation a little bit tonight, because this one's sort of personal for me. Personal for all of us. Interviews are like the heart of what we do, and they bring up a lot. You know, we're having this kind of directed, constricted conversation with our sources. It's work, but it becomes very provocative. Emotionally, psychologically, mentally, it's pretty intense. So let's talk about that a little bit. And the issue that is particularly of interest to me tonight is that for 6 years I taught a course until recently here that was basically an introduction to news reporting and writing. So I was teaching basic skills in news reporting and writing on stories involving science, health, and the environment. And a core skill is interviewing, which Dan helpfully recently described as the heart of our stories. So, Dan's obviously right. Interviews add intimacy, accuracy, and richness to our work. You can do a story without an interview, but you can tell it's flat. You don't feel great about it in many respects. So these interviews that we're doing are very crucial. They are nearly essential for any good piece of journalism or any good piece of science or health journalism. But for me, of all the modules I've taught, all the topics that we address in this course that I've taught, interviewing was the one that I struggled with the most, and it was my students, yay! I think it was SHRP 38 that helped me think more about interviewing and some of the issues that we might really try to take apart when we think about interviewing. And the specific question that my students asked was, if there are ground rules, right? There seem to be ground rules in interviews, but do our subjects, do our sources, the people we're talking to, actually know those ground rules? And there has long been an assumption that our sources do know those ground rules, but the more we talked about it, the more we thought, very few probably knew the ground rules. Even some of our elite sources, our highly advantaged sources, our government employee or political officials, elected individuals, scientists certainly, environmental and nonprofit leaders. You might think that all these people know the ground rules, but even in those situations, I think a lot of people don't. How many times have you been asked to, read back your story before it's published? So we won't get into that tonight, but I did want to bring up sort of that question of whether our sources really know what these ground rules are and whether we need to examine those ground rules. Just to throw out some of what those are, we are taught to be brief and efficient in our interviews. This is like the classic model, and I think we've all kind of moderated it a little bit or modulated it or questioned it ourselves, but classically we are taught to create stories that are fully editorially independent of our sources, but we guarantee our sources that we will write a fair and accurate story. We are taught to maintain a neutral attitude in these conversations. That is really hard sometimes, but we have become studied at doing this. Some of us are really good at maintaining that neutral attitude. What is the effect of that on our subjects? That's something to think about, especially when we're dealing with inequities and trauma, which are really two of the main topics that I think we need to talk about tonight. There's also been discussion recently of how extractive interviews are. There was a really good Neiman Lab piece that came out a few years ago that featured guidelines that came out of the University of Wisconsin, kind of talking about how can we make interviews less extractive from our sources. So anyway, tonight's conversation comes out of all those conversations I had with my students and my own discomfort with what happens during interviews and how can we do this, how can we rethink the interview? That was a great title that Dan came up with. So our panelists tonight have thought deeply on this subject. Freelance science journalist Tara Haelle frequently speaks and writes about ethical dilemmas, and that's one of the things we're talking about tonight, ethical dilemmas in journalism. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, National Geographic, Texas Monthly, NPR, The Washington Post, and Scientific American, among others, which is how we met, more or less. Tara is the author of Vaccine Investigation, The History and Science Behind Vaccines, and she's the co-author of The Informed Parent, a science-based resource for your child's first 4 years. And Naseem Miller is senior editor at the Journalist Resource, a project of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University. She's a former reporter at the Orlando Sentinel, and she helped cover the Pulse nightclub mass shooting tragedy in 2016, and later co-started a Facebook group called Journalists Covering Trauma. Important. So I think I'd like to start by asking each of you to help us get to know you a little better in the context of this discussion, and now that I've given your bona fides. Can you each tell me a little bit about your current work, but how it relates to like rethinking the interview and equity issues that can arise in interviewing? Tara, I know that happens in your beat work. Naseem, that happens, well, probably throughout your career, but at the Journalist Resource as well. Yeah.
Well, most of my reporting is on medical research or stories that use medical research as a backing to them. And these days, those are unexpectedly controversial stories often. Some of them used to always be controversial, but a lot more medical evidence is coming under scrutiny in the political sphere. So it has become dicier to interview people on some of those things. One of the things that I've covered for the thing I'm best known for covering is vaccines and vaccine hesitancy. And as social media has become increasingly prevalent in our lives and impactful in our lives, the way that I interview parents or sort of your ordinary people, your non-public figures in those areas, I think about what's the impact of this story going to be on them and what kind of blowback could happen to them. So, you know, when I'm talking to ordinary people, I think about the interview, how it will impact them and what my role in their life is, I guess. That sounds a little bit hoity-toity, but in other words, what risks are they taking by speaking to me, I guess is a better way of putting it. I feel like I have a responsibility to take that into account. At the same time, when I'm speaking with people who dispute settled evidence or who are promoting accurate evidence or promoting misinformation, the way that I conduct those interviews is definitely different. I'm not going to be as forgiving, frankly. I am not going to necessarily spell out the same ground rules that I might for other people. And if I'm interviewing a government official or a researcher or a company spokesperson, each one of those, the way that I approach that interview is slightly different. It's not completely different, but I mean, there are definitely tweaks to my approaches.
Naseem, can you talk a little bit about the Journalist Resource and how that relates to rethinking the interview?
Sure. So at the Journalist Resource, what we do, we kind of boil down a lot of academic research and studies for journalists so they can use it in their stories, and we really want to bridge the gap between news and academia. That's our main goal. And you know, back in the day when I was a student, I really wanted to be a science journalist, but my first job was a health reporter, and I've been a health reporter for all my career, and what I do right now is mostly health reporting as well. And I've talked with a lot of doctors and of course patients when you do these stories, and talked to scientists, but one of the most profound experiences I had, especially when it comes to interviewing, was after the mass shooting, when you go to talk to survivors of a tragic event. And that experience has stayed with me and also got me started into learning more about trauma in journalism, not only its impact on journalists, but impact on survivors and how we approach those interviews.
So yeah, let's go right into that. So I think when I'm teaching this material, how to do an interview, and I think when we think about journalism, sometimes it can seem very uniform, and we're taught, to treat everyone to a certain extent the same, to take the same approach. This is our approach, this is how we do it. But what I'm hearing from both of you, and no surprise, this is what we want to tease out tonight, is that it's not always the same, that the context matters. So what are the things, what are some of the basic ground rules that you might learn when you're a new person in journalism or just learning how to conduct an interview that need to be modified, that are not realistic to what happens during an interview when we're talking with people who are less media savvy, who have fewer advantages, or may have experienced trauma recently?
Do you want to talk first about trauma? Well, first of all, it's important to make sure they know that anything, like when you start speaking to them, unless they say, no, I don't want to speak with you, once they start speaking with you, they need to know that anything they say at that point forward can be printed unless they establish that it shouldn't be printed. And you would be surprised how many people don't know that. Even people you would expect to know. I literally last week was in New Orleans for a conference on pediatric rheumatology, where all I needed to do was kind of get fluff quotes from other scientists about the presentations, like, hey, what did you think was most interesting about that presentation? They could literally say, it was really interesting, and I will take it home to my patients. I mean, it could be nothing, but it can sometimes be hard to get them to talk. And I asked one person about it, and then once she finished telling me, she said, wait, are you going to quote me on that? Well, yeah, that was kind of the point. And she said, well, I don't want to be quoted. And I had to start over with somebody else because, I'm going to respect that. But then I realized from that point forward, when I was talking to people, I started saying, would you mind sharing some thoughts about this presentation on the record? I actually used the words on the record, which should be, I would think, goes without saying, but clearly didn't. I've also found myself having to explain, and this is, journalists have been explaining this, since Kingdom Come, what on the record versus off the record versus on background. And I think even within journalism, there's not always, like some people think off the record means you don't attribute it. Other people means you don't say it at all, period, no matter what, unless you get it from a different source. So there's different ways that people interpret that. But one of the ground rules I'll do is establish what that means. I don't tell them right up front that they won't be able to review the story, but if they ask me, what I will say is, if I have questions about something you said that I can't, I listened to the recording and I'm not positive I have it right, I will send you that to make sure I have it right, just that quote. Or if they've said something in a very wordy way and I need to paraphrase it, I might send them the paraphrase, like 2 sentences, and say, did I accurately paraphrase this? Because I'm paraphrasing and I want to make sure I have it right. But then from that point, one of the things I will do that's different with individuals that are sort of your everyday people, when I ask them their name, if they're talking to me about a really sensitive topic, such as whether or not they would vaccinate their child, which didn't used to be that controversial, but or when I was talking with abortion doctors who were providing care in areas that were didn't have much care, I would prefer to use their full names, but I tell them, if you would like to use your middle name instead, then I can do that. So in other words, I'm still using their real name, but I'm using their first and their middle name instead of their first and their last name. I will also say, and this is only specific to individuals that are like private individuals, so ordinary parents, if you will. I'll say, what is the nearest metropolitan area that you are comfortable being identified from? So I don't say, where are you from, so that they tell me the tiny town that they're from. I say that because if they live, outside of Buffalo, but they put themselves in Buffalo, New York, that's a layer of protection for them in not being found by crazies on the internet. And I feel to me, it's an ethical obligation of a journalist to not cause harm. That is in SPJ's, ethical guidelines. And you can inadvertently cause harm when you're doing your interviews if you're not thinking about the impact that interview could have on the person that you're interviewing. And that impact is different today than it was 10 years ago, than it was 20 years ago, largely because of social media, but not exclusively because of it. Changes in the political landscape, other things. Obviously, if I was interviewing a transgender teenager and their parent, I might have very different rules for how I interact with them. I will also be much more forgiving about what they can take back, if you will. I might, I'll let them know at the start of the interview, if you say something and you realize that you didn't mean to say it that way, or you want to rephrase it, or you're not comfortable actually having that printed, you can back up and say, I'd like that to be off the record. Now, I'm not going to do that with the, if I'm interviewing the president of Pfizer about something involving the vaccine, he doesn't get a pass on that. Whatever he says, and he should know better. If I'm talking to researchers and they're explaining their science, I might do something similar to that, unless I'm asking them to explain science that is heavily disputed or is being investigated for fraud. So I'm thinking about what the purpose is. And you could argue that that is not fair, but I subscribe more to the idea that what is equal is not fair and what is fair is not equal. In other words, fairness and equality are not synonyms. Sometimes fairness means giving one, if you think about playing golf in a fair way, sometimes fairness is giving someone a handicap and not having someone else have a handicap. That might be one way of looking at it. I've never played golf, but I think I did that right.
I have no idea.
It's like that. There was this meme that went around where it was like, this is equal, and it showed 3 people trying to watch a baseball game by looking over a fence, and they all had the same height of the steps that they were on, and then this is fair, and it had a different step for the height of each person so that all 3 of them could see equally over it, the difference there. So I'm thinking about these things. I'm thinking again about the risk that this person is taking. They're sharing their story with me, and I have a responsibility not only to get that story right, but not to harm them in the process, and to serve my readers, to make sure that the story I'm getting, the whole purpose of this is to serve my readers. My responsibility is not to my source, it's to my readers, but not at the expense of my source if it's an ordinary person who is generously giving me their time to share something. Now, if it's a more adversarial interview where they really didn't want to talk to me, but they had to, like, all bets are off. Like, I'm not going to pull any punches if I'm talking to somebody, about something that they don't want to talk to me, but they have to give me a comment. If I'm talking to RFK Jr. about vaccines, he doesn't get any passes. So it varies. I mean, I could probably go on forever about the different ways that I tweak things, but the point is I give thought to each individual interview's, it's not like I go through some process for each one, but I have categories in my head. And if I'm going to approach a person who's in category A or B or C, I approach that interview differently than I do if they're in a different category, because it depends on who they are, what they're giving me, what risks they're taking, what I need to get from them, how it serves the audience, all of those different factors go into it.
Oh, that's really good. Naseem, I'm sure you have thoughts about some of what Tara said, so you could go that direction, but I'm also really interested in, the process that you just described, that in covering the Pulse mass shooting, you started to rethink the interview.
Yeah, so things I've learned since then, and especially this sort of catchphrase we've been using more in the past year, is the whole concept of trauma-informed interviewing. And really it comes, it includes people who are survivors of tragic events, whether it's a mass shooting, whether it's sexual abuse, rape, etc. And when it comes to interviewing these survivors, really all bets are off. All the rules that we have for interviewing politicians and public figures kind of go out the door, and you need to take a breath and rethink your interview when you are talking to survivors, because one of the main things to remember is survivors have been through an event where they have lost control. So what you can do as somebody who's interviewing them and in a way maybe taking their story is to give a little control back to them. And that starts with very small things, such as, where would you like to meet? Instead of you picking the place to meet. Or when you want to ask a question, where would you like to start? Instead of you deciding where to start the interview. So giving them a sense of control is very important. Empathy is very important. And there are just little things that in books and articles that have been written where survivors have talked about their experiences with the media, never to say, I understand how you feel, because we probably don't understand how they feel. So don't say I understand. And talking about feelings, one of the questions that a lot of survivors are not happy with is when we ask them, how do you feel? Because it's such a basic question, and what do you expect them to feel, right? So there are other ways you can approach that question so they can think about the feelings instead of making them feel. Some of those questions are sort of, you can ask them, what were your first thoughts? Or you can ask them, when you reflect on the event, what comes to your mind? Or you can ask them, what's been the impact on you? Or how are you coping? And when it comes to understanding this whole concept of trauma-informed reporting, don't let it overwhelm you, or if you don't know where to start, really the basic thing you can do is to educate yourself on trauma and how it impacts the human body. What are some of the terminologies? And a great place to start there, of course, is DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. The DART Center has a great style guide where a lot of words that are related to trauma and psychology and trauma science are explained in there for you, and tell you how to use them, when to use them in your stories. And when you're going to do interviews that involve trauma or traumatic event, read up on it. How do people deal with grief? What people have said when they experience loss. So in that way, when you go in, you know what to expect a little bit. When people have different reactions, don't take it personally, because trauma impacts people, their memories. So there are a lot of little things that you can learn by just reading little by little, and understanding that interviewing survivors is very different from interviewing your public figure and politicians.
Thanks, that's very helpful. How is this issue of rethinking the interview specific to the kinds of topics we cover and stories we tell in science, health, and environmental journalism? I'm wondering if there's something about our B that has made it easier or harder to start to rethink the interview.
That's an easy one for me, because I cover a lot of the same topics that interest me because they impact my life. I didn't actually plan to be a science and health journalist. I didn't know that was a thing. I found out by accident when I was digging into information about vaccines, because I just had a baby and I was gonna make decisions about vaccinating my child. And the more I looked into that, and I was like, oh, I don't know how to read these studies. And then I tried to learn how to read the studies, and then I got a job writing about studies, and I was like, oh, I don't know how to write these studies. I need to learn how. And the more I went down that path and learned how to read studies, how to report on them, and thought about how they impact the decisions that I make in my own life. Do I make a decision about my own health based on a single study? No, I don't. I make it on a consensus of the research. But thinking about all those things means that I was pursuing topics that had a personal interest for me. So I will often share stories of my own when I'm interviewing people. Sometimes it might be, for example, if I'm interviewing someone who is vaccine hesitant and they are really uneasy, maybe they're even a quote unquote anti-vaxxer, I will tell them, when my first child was born, I refused the hepatitis B vaccine. And I did, and I tell them why. And I tell them that so that they know I am not this is not going to be an adversarial conversation where I'm going to challenge them on whether they're a good parent or not because they are uneasy about vaccines. Now, keep in mind, when I say this, I'm not interviewing like the anti-vaccine advocate who's up on the stage talking to people, because I don't give those people a platform. So I'm referring to where the everyday parent that is, has chosen not to vaccinate because they're genuinely scared, and we're trying to understand their perspective. I want them to be truthful for me, and I don't want them to be on their guard. And so I will share things about my own life so that they understand that I get it's scary to vaccinate your child in certain circumstances, or in lots of circumstances. When I was interviewing abortion doctors who were providing care in areas where they basically, like, they live in Illinois and they'd fly to Texas or fly to Alabama, back when it was legal to do that. I would definitely break a rule in that you're not supposed to bring your own personal feelings into the conversation or have your own thoughts about, the issue. I would be very frank about the fact that I hated living in a state where my own reproductive choices were in question, because it was I'm a woman. I'm not going to deny that reality. I'm not objective about that, and I'm not going to pretend like I am. I'm going to be transparent about it, and I think that's, as long as I'm being honest about it, I think that's not inappropriate, and that can help them also see, okay, they don't see me as an ally, but they at least see that they understand I know where they're coming from and why they're providing this care. I also would interview, I've interviewed doctors who are against abortions, and I don't pull any punches there either, and I'll make it clear I have some concerns about this. I'm not going to be dishonest with them and say like, oh yeah, we need to protect human life. Like, I'm not pandering, but I'm basically sharing tidbits of my life when it feels appropriate. And when I say when it feels appropriate, it's not like I'm listening to the interview waiting for a chance to tell them something about myself. It's more that if they say something that triggers a thought in my head, like a normal conversation is occurring, I think of interviews as conversationals. Yes, they're transactional, but they're also conversations, and you won't get genuine quotes, good information, accurate information if they aren't comfortable and they don't feel like they can truly share what they're thinking. And the more you make it feel like a genuine conversation with a give and take instead of just a take, the more they're going to relax and give you what you actually need. And it's not a trick, it's just genuinely connecting with other people. So I will, because I report on health and science, I would argue that health and science beat is the most important of all your beats, obviously. But I have a good reason for that. As far as I know, with the exception of maybe business where you're doing investments, health and science is the only time where someone might read an article, go home, and change something they do in their life that day, literally. Okay? I did this myself. I did a story on colon cancer for National Geographic, and the next day I called my doctor and made an appointment for my colonoscopy. So I know I'm not the only one who did that. So, we have a lot of responsibility in doing that, and that means we also have a lot of responsibility in getting good information from these interviews. And so that kind of conversational sharing, I think, comes out of the fact that I am genuinely interested in the topics that I am writing about.
Is that how you think of it also, Naseem? Is there something specific to our beat that makes the interview particularly important to think carefully about how we conduct?
Well, I have to tell you, when you asked the question, the thing I thought about is, like I told you guys, I've been a health reporter throughout all my career, and I never thought I would be in a situation where I'll be covering shooting in our backyard. So you never know what your beat is going to bring you. You might think you're always going to be interviewing scientists, et cetera, but especially if you are in a newsroom where there are other beats of coverage, when tragedy struck, which unfortunately happens all parts of the country, it's all hands on deck. And that's why you need to kind of prepare yourself in your mind, not only for interviews that you do every day with scientists and academics, but also everyday people and people who might be survivors. And you might end up having to talk to survivors of tragedies for your science stories. It could be about psychology or other issues. So that's why I think it's very important. And of course, I'm very interested and passionate about the trauma and journalism part of things, to learn about trauma and how it impacts our brain and the survivors, but also how it could practice in trauma-informed journalism, how it could protect you as journalists, because when you stick to your values, you also protect yourself and your health and mental health. So that's another, I really want you guys, as you go through your career, to avoid burnout and all the stresses that our jobs and the environment of journalism today brings. So that's one of the things you can do to stick to set of rules and values that you are comfortable with.
May I add something real quick? Not about that, I thought about it was, another thing is when you're talking to scientists, one of the most important things to get from a scientist in many interviews is an anecdote, right? We all want a good anecdote from our scientists. And a lot of scientists are lousy at providing anecdotes, and doctors are lousy because they're worried about violating patient confidentiality. I have found that when I share an anecdote about my life, it triggers something, and it triggers them to think of one. So, if I'm doing a story about obesity, and I talk about my own experience going to a doctor who, the interaction that we had focused too much on obesity and not on the other problem I had, it might trigger a patient they had that came in and said something similar. And so I've actually gotten good anecdotes. I'll actually first start with, do you have any anecdotes about what, or can you tell me of a patient story? And they're like, oh, I can't think of one. And then later on, they'll say something and it'll trigger my own anecdote. I'll share my experience. And they're like, oh, I had a patient once who. So it's actually a way to sort of, that mirroring, that you can get those treasured anecdotes that we always want for our stories.
Yeah. Naseem, you said something about protecting your own values, protecting yourself. That sounds like a rethink of the interview too. Can you expand on that?
So when, a lot of time, and that's a lot of discussions too, once you guys, especially maybe some of you are already working in newsrooms, it's very difficult for us to push back against some stories. But there are some stories that deep in your heart you shouldn't be doing. You shouldn't be knocking on the door of somebody who just lost a loved one. And more there are conversations that you should push back on these kind of situations and tell your editor, I don't think this is a good idea to do this now. Another thing that you can do if you're in a situation where you have to approach someone is to take no for an answer. But what you can do is leave your information, your card, if you have one, with the person and tell them, I'm there. When you feel comfortable, please speak with me. And I've heard from several journalists that kind of helps open the door in the future. So it's very important in these situations, instead of being aggressive, trying to get a quote for a story, especially when there's a breaking news situation, to approach people with calmness and empathy and understand and put yourself in their shoes. How would you want somebody to approach you? And all these little steps that you take over time can help you feel better about how you approach somebody else. And I think, sticking to some of these rules will help you over a long period of time.
So how does a reporter who wants to stick to those values and feels uncomfortable with an assignment deal with an antagonistic editor who's saying, look, we need this story?
Yeah, there's no simple answer to that. It depends what kind of editor you have. I wish I could say you'd be like, I'm not doing it, and go sit back at your desk. But, but sometimes it doesn't work that way. But I really think having these conversations, hopefully young journalists, as you guys enter the newsrooms, you can start changing the conversation, or at least having these conversations with your editors and talking about trauma-informed journalism. And maybe over time, you can change this whole practice of door knocking after tragedies, and giving survivors a little bit of space before they talk to us. Because a lot of times, trauma affects our brain, our memory, and a lot of times people can't really articulate what they experience right then and there. So giving it time could be actually beneficial for the accurate stories that we tell. So all of these conversations hopefully will penetrate newsrooms little by little.
Eventually, I want to ask you specifically a little bit more about how trauma affects the brain, but Tara has something and Dan has something too, so.
I would just say real quick, when you're pushing back on an editor, always pivot to what's going to serve the readers, because that's what we all care about, right? So if you can reframe what they're asking and say, I don't think that would serve the readers because blah, 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 but what would serve the readers is if we did, and you offer an alternative. So you make it, always go back to what's going to serve the readers. And it's like you said, it's not going to serve the readers if you're getting inaccurate responses. I use this when I push back on false balance issues. It's a completely different topic, but when I've had editors say, I want you to go and talk to this super anti-vaccine activist, and I'm like, no, I'm not going to. I'm sorry, it's not going to serve our readers to give them a platform. So I think reframing it as to what is actually going to serve our readers and giving them an alternative to whatever it is they want.
That's really smart. Dan?
Yeah, I thought I would ask the first question just to get people motivated to stand up behind me and ask more questions. So readers or sources think that what we want from them is information and maybe their opinion, their take, but we really want much more than that. We want anecdote, like we were talking about. We want a story. We want stories from them, and we especially want emotion. And the hard question is, are we really entitled to that? And to what extent are we entitled? And my whole career, I have justified some of the crazy things that I've done by saying, well, I'm presenting them with the option, and no means no, and if someone tells me no, I respect that. But now, at this point in my career, I wonder whether that's just a story that we tell ourselves as journalists, and whether that's just an elaborate rationalization, and whether I'm just giving them the option, really is an adequate rationale? Is it ever not an adequate rationale? And how do we figure out that calculus? That's what I'd like to hear from you guys.
For me, that goes back to what I said at the very beginning about thinking about the risks that they're taking by talking to you. If you can, I'm not presuming that, that you can necessarily know what all those risks might be, but trying to give some thought to that. Thinking about serving the reader without harming the source, assuming that it's a source who doesn't deserve to be harmed. And I don't mean that like I'm trying to harm someone, but I'm saying if I'm reporting on someone who's committed fraud, like I'm not, my job is not to protect that source, obviously. But you know, truth has to come out over non-harm. But if it's like an ordinary person, you know, thinking of it in that regard, like not intentionally causing harm, as opposed to harm that they brought upon themselves. If that, I'm trying to distinguish between those. But so what's going to serve the readers without disserving, I guess, the source, and that can go across the board, because even if I am interviewing someone in an adversarial situation, I need to give them the respect of responding to whatever accusations have been levied against them, or giving them a say in what they're saying. I've actually interviewed a child predator who was convicted at a jail before, and I had to go in there with the thought ahead of time that whether he did or didn't commit this crime, he was claiming he didn't commit it. Most people say they're innocent behind bars. I still had to give him his say, if you will. When in thinking about the stories we tell ourselves, I think if you approach it from the perspective of what is this person going to get out of this? How can, you know, why would they want to talk to me? What benefit, how does this benefit them in any way? And what risks are they taking? And if just giving thought to that, I think, can help you in how you approach it. And I think it's okay to even discuss that with the source. I think you can go to the source and say, I'm thinking that if you talk to me, it gives an opportunity to pass along this information to our readers, which I think is really important because blah, blah, blah. I can understand where you may or may not feel comfortable with that. What do you think? I mean, we might have a discussion about whether they're going to be a source or not. I've talked to people before and said, hey, can we have an off-the-record conversation about whether we're going to have an on-the-record conversation?
Yeah. Naseem, you must have thought about this, the right to know issue.
Right. I mean, I guess nobody has to tell us our stories, but we do stories with different hopes. We do investigative projects with hopes of change because we think there's something wrong with a certain part of the system. But, you know, as to what Tara was saying too, one of the important things you can do, especially with people who are at a situation of less privilege, is this whole concept of informed consent. And that is taking the time ahead of time before the interview starts to explain everything to, and I'm again talking about people who are not public figures, who don't have media training, that, all right, this is what it means on the record, off the record, on background. This is where the story is going to appear. These are how many eyeballs are going to be on your story. These are the consequences potentially if your name is seen. Are you okay with that? And it's very important to share with them that you can't promise any specific outcome because we never know how our stories are going to be impacted. You know, you work months on a story and there's like crickets, and a quick story gets like thousands of hits. So it's very important to let readers know what they should expect or should not expect. So when you get ready, lay all these ground rules, especially for longer form projects and more longer sit-down interviews, you can be at least at peace that you know your source knows why you're doing this. And it's very important to create boundaries with the sources, that you're not their friend in this situation. You are gonna follow up with them over time. And once the interview is over, you should let them know that I'm gonna, you know, circle back with you, check your quotes with you. You know, with survivor stories, a lot of times there are some journalists who actually read the whole story back to the survivors to make sure they got all the information correctly. Again, this is a whole different set of rules than interviewing public figures. And let them know when the story is published, and then check back with them, get their feedback. So all of these things could help in the longer term process. But yeah, I mean, we are very grateful to everybody who shares our stories, and we are always amazed that people open up to us, and that's a great thing.
Definitely. I'm sorry?
Oh, I was going to ask a question. If I can share it.
Go for it.
Something you said about creating boundaries made me think of something I really wanted to share. The only time I've had to call the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma for myself to seek my own help was because I was working with a source who had come to me. She found me online. She was a victim of domestic abuse. Her sons were being physically and sexually abused by her husband, who was a colonel in the military. It was one of the most difficult stories I've ever written. She continued to come to me because she had this idea that my stories were going to change things. And I had to keep reminding her, I can't get your kids back for you. Only a lawyer can do that. I can't do that. And she would text me very frequently at times that were all off. The last time that she texted me was on Mother's Day. And she was asking me to do something, and I was with my kids and my husband, and I said, it's Mother's Day. I'm not really comfortable having this. We can talk another time. She was kind of frustrating me. I had trouble laying down boundaries. That evening, she died by suicide. I found out the next day. My husband had to come and get me because I couldn't drive home. I was not in a good place. And that was, the fallout of that is what led me to seek, I ended up getting a mentor from the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. But I say that because I had to remind myself that, she didn't die by suicide because I made her do that. She had been in a place that could have been described as suicidal for a long time up until that. At this point, I'd been speaking to her off and on for a year and a half. She had even heard my kids a couple times because I'd be in the car and she'd call and I'd, answer the phone and my kids are in there and she's saying hi to them. So, I had interviewed her kids. So it had been very difficult to figure out where those boundaries were, not just for her, but for me and protecting myself. And the fact that the last time that I interacted with her on a text message was trying to lay down one of those boundaries, I had to kind of work through the fact that I was doing my job correctly. I was right to lay down those boundaries. I didn't make her commit suicide by laying down those boundaries, but it still had a big impact on me. And so that boundaries is not just for your sources, it's for you as well.
It sounds really rough. Thank you so much for telling us that. Joanna, did you have a question?
Hi. Yeah, I was wondering if you have any advice for journalists who might be trying to get through an interview with a source that's recently experienced trauma. I had an experience recently where I had to follow up with a source. I had interviewed them previously, and then one of their good friends was murdered by police, and I had to go back and interview them about that. And I found it extremely difficult, even though the source was, they were great. They were, willing to provide me information. They wanted to speak to me, but I was crying so hard during the interview that I could barely get a word out. And I'm wondering if you have any any advice for how to deal with a situation like that as a journalist who wants to project a certain level of professionalism, I guess.
Yeah, I think the advice usually for that, since it is our job when we're doing the interview, is to make a mental note of how you're feeling. Maybe take a pause if you need to. Maybe take a sip of water, take a deep breath, and finish your interview. And afterward, take a break, talk to your editor, talk to your friends to process the information you were sharing. And if you find yourself in such a bad situation where you're crying more than your source, where you can't handle the information you're receiving, it is okay to stop the interview, because you don't want your source to feel guilty because they've already been through a trauma. So it is okay to say, you have to stop it, and it's not their fault, but we all have our personal stories and our trauma that we bring into our lives, and don't feel guilty about how you felt. It's okay to feel however you feel, but be mindful that as a reporter, as an interviewer, you're doing your job. And if you can, hold on to your emotions, until the end. And after that, please talk to somebody. One of the most important things in self-care when we talk about trauma and building resiliency as journalists is having a peer support team. So figure out who's your A team, who are your friends, your coworkers, or whether it's your boss, who you can turn to and share this information and talk this out. If you have a therapist that you go to regularly, if it's the person who can talk this out with you. And the DART Center has this new project called the Journalist Trauma Support Network, where it's a new project, but they're starting to connect journalists with therapists who are trained on our jobs. So again, there are resources out there, but please, however you're feeling, even if I can tell it's still affecting you, please find someone to talk it out with and find out what's the source of it maybe, or how you can prevent it from happening again, or maybe there's some subjects that you can avoid covering. It is okay if it doesn't feel right for you, and you can have that conversation with your editor for whatever reason that you are not able to cover a certain topic.
Great question. I almost feel like we could start suggesting as mentors and teachers of early career journalists to prepare themselves for these kinds of interactions, and to have kind of like a go kit that we're supposed to put together after 9/11 or a blackout. And it's just like, okay, what would be my support system? What would be my plan of action? If I do start crying in this interview, what's my strategy going to be? Am I going to say, look, I have to call you back in 5 minutes or a half hour, or something came up? How are you going to manage that? So that might be something we can start to prime our students and mentees to prepare for.
Yeah, that's one of the big things about interviewing survivors and doing difficult interviews, emotional interviews, is really having a plan beforehand, during, and after. So talking, like you said, sort of like having a toolkit and having some sort of checklist, like beforehand, do your research, understand what this person potentially could be going through. If there are documents available, read some of the details so you don't have to make your source go through some facts you can already gather from other resources. And during the interview, again, once you are prepared to what you might be facing, that could be make it a little easier for you to process the information you're receiving. And if you're going with a photographer or a videographer, please discuss that with them too, because they are there absorbing this information. So, and afterward, it's very important if you can take a break. Don't immediately go back to your computer, start typing your story, and talk it out with someone.
I think you can also, in that planning process, think about the emotional salience of the questions that you're asking and the order you're asking them in. One of my very earliest experiences with interviewing, I was an undergraduate, and I did an undergraduate honors thesis on women. It was an oral history of women who served in Vietnam but not as nurses. And I learned really quickly to sort of have sort of this ebb and flow of my questions, where I would start out with the easy questions, what was your years of service, when did you go, why did you join the military? And then we'd work our way up to maybe the first sort of battle experience or whatnot that they had. And then I'd pull back a little bit and we'd say, what did you guys do for recreation while you were there in country, And then we would work our way up to another difficult topic, and then I would pull back and, do you still stay in touch with the people? And that ebb and flow, it depends on the circumstances. I mean, that was a very different experience than some of the people you were interviewing, but I've done that with interviewing sexual assault survivors as well, where you go back and forth between, okay, once you decided you had to leave, who did you talk to? And then we go up to the next violent incident that happened. And then you pull, so planning your questions in a way that gives sort of these sort of emotional breaks, if you will, it helps them and it helps you, I think.
Yeah, and I think it bears mentioning that these kind of experiences that we have as journalists could come up in any conversation. So it might behoove us to just sort of prepare for that, even when we're calling a source we don't expect to tell us something kind of startling or emotionally packed. Anyway, was there another question?
Hi, my name is Noah Augustine, and I just wanted to ask if you guys think there are any interview norms that should be eliminated completely.
That's a great question. So Noah's asking, are there any norms or standard approaches in interviews that should be completely eliminated? I like that. Or is it all nuance, you know? I mean, the all nuance answer
That's a
kind of
good
bugs
question.
me. I want a little, I would love some, a
Darn
little
these
more
kids
guidance.
coming up with good questions. You're going to be a good interviewer. I don't know that there's, I guess I'd have to go through a list of the norms myself to see. One thing that comes in mind is, I guess in terms of absolutes, I don't think it's appropriate to have an absolute that a source should never look at quotes that they have given you for a story ahead of time. That is often thought of as one of the classic absolutes. Now, I don't share a story. I'm not going to share the whole story. That is kind of an absolute, unless your editor says there's some good reason for you to do it, and your editor's totally on board with it. But there are circumstances where I think, especially like, for example, some of the outlets I actually write for require this. Cure Magazine requires you to share your story. Now they actually require your whole story to be shared with your sources, and I think it's for accuracy's sake, and it's also to make sure that the story of the patient is accurate. But if I'm interviewing like a patient for a cancer story, I might pull together the whole of all the quotes that I'm going to use of theirs and put them all together and say, is all of this accurate? And I think that that can be okay, because it's not a gotcha thing. I'm not trying to like get some, secret information that they don't want to give me. My goal is accuracy. And again, what's going to serve the readers? What's going to serve the readers is that it's accurate and that it's salient, and it's, and if they have some discomfort with something that was said there, then we can talk about that, whether they want to do that or not. Like, I realize I'm opening myself up to that if I do that. So it's, I have to be prepared for that ahead of time, and what my strategy is. Or I might say, these are the quotes I've already provided my editor, so that you are aware. If there's an inaccuracy, let me know. Be advised that unless it's inaccurate, my editor may not be willing to change it. You always throw your editor under the bus. Seriously. Always throw your editor under the bus. It's never your fault. It's always the editor's fault, even if it's your. I really wanted to use your interview, but I put like 5 of your quotes in, and the editor cut them all. You don't say that they were a crap interview and you just couldn't use anything from them, right? It's all the editor's fault. So I guess that's the only one that comes to mind, is sort of an absolute that I would not consider an absolute. And that will be controversial. There are people who will disagree with me on that, and that's okay. But that's all I can think of.
Well, there are a couple of things. One thing I mentioned, the whole idea of door knocking after tragedies. It's not only very difficult on people we're approaching when they've been through an awful event, and here we are with our cameras and recorders and notebooks. And it's very difficult also on reporters who have to do it because their editor has asked them to go get a quote. I mean, so I hope more newsrooms reconsider that. And the other thing is how we cover mass tragedies. One thing, I guess, hopefully none of you have covered it, and we end up having to cover it, but when these events happen in your backyard and they're in the large scale, hundreds of media outlets descend upon the town, and everybody wants to interview the survivors and the families, and it's mayhem and it's awful. And one of the things I remember from Pulse is, it was the second day after the shooting, where they were identifying the 49 victims, and they were telling people in this one building, telling families whether their loved ones survived or not. And there was hundreds of cameras and microphones out there really swarming these poor families who were coming out of these buildings, receiving awful news, shoving their cameras on them. And of course, the families weren't saying anything. There was a church group who started forming circles around them to protect them from us, which makes you feel awful. I mean, standing in the periphery watching this makes you wonder, well, why are we doing this? there were people running around trying to get interviews from people who are still in shock, who are grieved. And there are sometimes discussions, I wish, we could have a couple of outlets that would feed everybody else. And it sounds like such a great idea, but I feel like the competition between the news outlets will never let that happen, because everybody wants to be there and get the story and get the big scoop.
I have a question. I have not covered a mass tragedy like that. I've had to do door knocking before after a mass shooter, but it was the shooter's family that I was door knocking. That was fun. This is an idea that came to my mind while you were talking. What would happen if, would this be appropriate? This could be a crazy, stupid idea. If you got a poster board and you sat down further away and you put on the poster board, I'm a reporter from such and such. I'm here if you want to talk. And you just sat there and waited. I don't know. That just came to my head.
There are pool reporters. There is such a thing as a pool reporter. And I mean,
Yeah.
when I covered the space beat, there would be, one or two reporters, I forget, usually Associated Press, was allowed in to speak with sources. So there are approaches to doing this on other beats, but they're not usually applied in the case of a disaster. Yeah. I just want to add one rule that I think we can drop immediately, Noah, which is the prohibition of expressing empathy, basically. And that's when we don't have to be neutral recipients of horrifying information. We can tell people that sounds awful, that shouldn't have happened to you. I've written down a bunch of them. That's unacceptable behavior. Children should not be harmed. There are some basic principles of humanity that I think it's okay to express during an interview. I don't think you're really biasing your source or showing your own bias by saying those. I mean, maybe to an extent you are, but I think that's one of my personal rules, is that I want to be able to express some sort of empathy, even if it's for them just as a human, even if I don't completely love their attitude or feel compassion toward every aspect of them when they're expressing that difficult moment. I think it's the right thing to do, to express some empathy, some form of empathy that doesn't necessarily say, I believe every single thing you've told me and and I agree with everything you've told me, but to just say, I'm a human too, and that sounds rough.
I find that interesting because I never knew that was a rule. Like that, to me, that's not. I would never have thought to say not to do that, because I have never not done that. And I think, how many here know it? If I say the number 42, how many people know what I'm talking about when I say the number 42? A couple of people out there. 42 is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Okay, I decided a decade ago that I know what 42 is, and it's empathy. And that was something I decided in my own life, and that has nothing to do with my job specifically. That embodies how I go through life. And so to me, the idea of not expressing empathy when it's called for in an interview would never even have occurred to me. If I was breaking a rule, tough shit. Oh, excuse me. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. Too bad.
Cool. I think we'll take this opportunity to turn to our next question.
Hi. First, I want to thank you both for speaking so frankly about these really difficult topics and your own reporting experiences. These are some of the ugly parts of journalism, and I think it's important that we talk about them, so I appreciate it. On a more lighthearted note, though, one question that I have had for a while now and just haven't really talked about it much with anyone outside of my classmates is that I've noticed more and more that when I start interviews, and I'm one of those people who likes to do interviews on Zoom so that I'm face-to-face with that person if I can't be with them in person, but I've noticed more that before I kind of jump into the questions, my source will often say, before we get started, actually, I have a question for you. Can you tell me more about yourself and, the basis of this story, et cetera? And I find that it, especially the first few times that it happened, it kind of took me off guard because I wasn't used to that. I was used to just asking if it's okay to record, and then I ease into my questions, ask how they are, and then ease into my questions. But I'm wondering if that's something that maybe we should think about doing, because it kind of is a wake-up call to me every time that, oh yeah, I'm also a human here, and you deserve to know who I am and what I do beyond being an environmental journalist as much as, I deserve to sit here and listen to you tell me, about your life or information about a study or so forth. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on maybe if there's a shift there that we should think about doing as journalists.
I love that question because I didn't realize I was doing it until you just asked that question, but I've started doing that without being prompted to. Maybe it's the Zoom effect or the pandemic effect, but I've noticed myself when I contact people to interview them, sometimes when I reach out to interview them, I might actually, I'll introduce myself there. And if it's going to be a sensitive topic, I might tell them other things I've written about, and I'll even link to other stories I've written. But I have found that when I do, especially Zoom interviews, but also on phone interviews, I'll start the interview by saying, so this is what the story is about. And I'll tell them, I'm interested in finding out X, Y, Z, and I'm hoping that you can help me understand ABC. And I don't know when I started doing that, actually, but I do that, and I find it's helpful. And it's actually led to some really interesting conversations, because one time I did that, and I was interviewing a physician I was doing a story about myocarditis and whether or not it was as serious from the vaccine as it was from COVID. And I was interviewing a physician, and I made the assumption that it wasn't going to be as serious because I talked to 3 other cardiologists who led me to believe that. Well, he felt differently, and he felt it was more serious. And it wasn't adversarial per se, but he started out with, well, it sounds as though you already have made up your mind about blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, I have gotten that impression from these other cardiologists, but that's why I'm talking to you, because if you feel differently, then I need to know that. Or I would say, I've had sources literally try and call me out on something before, make me feel stupid, and I say, well, that's why I'm talking to you, because if I'm wrong, you need to tell me I'm wrong. And I turn it around, because I have no pride in this situation. It's not about me, it's about the topic, it's about what will serve the audience, it's about what the information is they're gonna give me. So I definitely think that there's advantages to starting that way, and I think I don't even know when I started doing it, I just know that I started doing it at some point.
Yeah, I mean, especially interviewing scientists and researchers and doctors, there have been very few who, like, when we start talking, and I think Zoom has kind of prompted that too, is like, so tell me about you, who are you? Like, and it kind of takes you by surprise, because usually people know we are just journalists calling them and they answer our questions. But then I put myself in their shoes, and I'm like, yeah, I would want to know who's interviewing me. So I answer the questions, and I don't find it intrusive, and it's fine to tell them, whatever you want about them, to put them also at ease about the conversation you're going to have. So I think it's fine. It's a good question. But, if they don't ask you, I don't think you have to share, like, about your background, etc. But it's good to tell what story you're working on. Transparency is a good key.
Another fun thing about Zoom is you have control over what's in your background. That can be a fun icebreaker. I have an antique vibrator on the bookcase behind my office desk. I've mentioned that to a couple of OBGYNs that I interview, and it really breaks the ice nicely.
Next question.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I have a question, and I was wondering if you can share any thoughts or any guidance on interviewing people with disabilities, because it happened to me last year. I did a story, and a bunch of my sources couldn't speak to me. Like, they would be like, no, I can only email you, or I don't feel comfortable on Zoom or whatever, and I got a lot of pushback from my editors. So I ended up wondering if the interview format was inclusive enough. Any thoughts on that?
Was the question about being inclusive about our sources? Is that what you were?
Yeah, no, people with disability, and interviewing people with disabilities.
Oh, actually, there is a great style sheet on that, and I'm trying to think of what the organization is that does it. I can see it in my own files on my computer, and I can't think of what it is. But if you Google style guide reporting disabilities, it's a really great. It covers that. And one thing I will say that is challenging when you're interviewing, and I'm about to show you how challenging it is, disabled people or people with disabilities, is that simply deciding whether to use person first language, which is person with a disability, or identity first language, disabled person, varies depending on who you're talking to. And I think it's important to find out from the person you're talking to what they prefer. And this is where you'll get into pushback with editors. I ran into this multiple times when reporting on autism. there are individuals who want to be identified as an autistic adult or an autistic child, and that is their preference, and they are not a person with autism. They are an autistic person. And then there are other people, it's often parents, not always, their child has autism. They are a child with autism. And the preference of the editor is usually, well, we have to be consistent. No, you don't actually have to be consistent. I'm sorry, but you don't. They want to be called an autistic person. That's who they are. To me, that's as fundamental as using the proper pronouns for transgender individuals. I think that's, if we go back to maybe rules that can be broken, I think requiring a standardization on terminology that doesn't necessarily actually require standardization is something that we should reconsider.
Did that answer the question? Cool. Next.
Is that the National Center on Disability and Journalism Saturday?
It could be. I just don't remember.
Okay.
Very, very
that
possibly.
That might be your answer, Gina. I wanted to go back to what we were talking about earlier of kind of like do no harm journalism, and if we're rethinking a lot of parts of the interview, also about are we rethinking how we grant anonymity for folks. I'm working on a story about, excuse me, I'm working on a story right now about wildland firefighter pay, and a lot of people are very not happy about including their name. And when I push back and ask, like, hey, what are you worried about? They talk about like a culture, not necessarily of intimidation, but just people don't talk with the media and say that it might influence their ability to get their job. And when I ask, are there people who are doing that? They kind of are cagey about it. And some of these people are people that maybe aren't the most necessary to telling my story, but they are like vital sources for me. And so I'm curious, how should I approach these conversations around anonymity when it's not like life or death, or are there these more nuanced gray areas where it may reflect in a bad light on their ability to get a new job, but I don't really have the way to verify their being anxious or scared about that.
Can you just repeat the topic that you're, I couldn't.
So I'm working on a story about wildland firefighters, specifically their pay. A story about wildland firefighters.
Wildland?
Yeah, like the people who are fighting wildfires in the forests and whatnot. And specifically, it's a story about their pay and how it's mostly been inadequate for a while.
Wow. Okay. Sorry, I had not heard that term before. Thank you for asking that. One thing I would say, I think there's a case-by-case basis. I don't think we can have general rules on this, and it's going to depend on the outlet. It's going to depend on what serves the story. It's going to depend on how essential that person is to the story. It's going to depend on the editor. But I think we do need to rethink what it means to be a life or death situation, because maybe not getting a job is a life or death situation in certain instances. So I think we need to consider, when I'm interviewing parents who are or are not vaccinating their children, that can have a big impact on how their own child is treated at school. And that's one of the reasons I'll take that into account. For professions, boy, that's tricky. I think it would be on a case-by-case basis. I might defer to my little loophole of using first and middle name. But I think that's a hard question, and I don't have a solid answer. I think it's going to, again, depend on the specific story and how essential they are to it, and maybe what they're sharing with you. So it's hard for me to give a real specific answer in that circumstance, but I think it raises lots of questions that are worth thinking about that maybe we haven't thought about as carefully as we should have in the past.
Yeah, this is a place I would definitely have a conversation with my editor, and if you're writing for a publication, they probably have rules in place. And one of the reasons I think we don't use anonymous sources is also building trust with our readers. So that's why, I don't know, it's a tricky situation you're in, and I understand, but hopefully you can find at least a few people who are willing to go on the record to show that, whatever situation it is you're trying to show.
I will get to the next question, but I just want to add something I learned doing some investigative work, and I was talking to my colleague Hannah Furfaro, who's now at the Seattle Times, about this, and what she said is sometimes when you're starting from zero in an investigation and it's hard to get anyone to open up on the record or to give you their name, start with off the record and just start laying your groundwork and your reporting and your context with those off the record or background conversations. And eventually, if you gain trust and keep talking with some of those individuals, some of them will be willing to go on the record, and you can bet that happened with all the Me Too conversations that ended up, the names that started coming out with the sexual harassment in cinema and beyond that became revealed in the last several years.
To build on that, you can also find out what I will term a linchpin source, which is sort of the floodgate source. When I was doing that interview with the women who had served in Vietnam, every woman I initially contacted would not speak with me. And then I reached a woman who had been a commander. And I went and met her in San Antonio. I drove and met her, and she felt very comfortable with me. And all of a sudden, I got like 20 emails of people willing to talk to me because she was sort of she was the one who opened the gates and said, "I've vetted this chick, she's okay," you know. And so doing those off-the-record conversations can help you identify who those sort of linchpin sources are, so that you know where to focus your efforts.
Another question?
Yeah, I have another question. If you're talking to a source who you know may be untrustworthy, and they're telling you something that you know may be untrue but can't be proven, how do you go about talking to that person, and how do you go about in turn writing about the interview you had with that person?
I go back to every Thanksgiving conversation I've had with my Fox News relatives. I use Socratic questioning. I use questions back to them of what makes you think that, where can you help me understand the information that would corroborate that? You know, I don't call them a liar, but I ask them I keep digging for more information, and either they'll clam up, and then I say, when I asked for further corroboration, they said, you know, depends on if I have to include that. I may not include that information if I don't think it's reliable enough, but if for some reason their belief is important, and I'm thinking of all the politicians who are making false statements about things that are not true in the evidence right now, you know, constantly asking them those follow-up questions, which we don't see enough of. Recently, I forget her name, who did the 60 Minutes interview with Marjorie Taylor Greene recently and got a lot of pushback on that. There was a great article in Neiman about that, and it was Neiman or Pointer, I can't remember. And the argument was, no, she is a figure who is in the news and is having an influence, so she is fair game, but there should have been more pushback, basically. You should be asking for more, there should have been a lot more challenging of the questions. So if they're giving you stuff that's not reliable, I think you have a responsibility to continually dig and dig and dig and dig. And you need to try and, you don't want to be rude about it, but if you get to the point where you've lost all tact, I mean, you might have to say, I'm sorry, but I'm having a really hard time believing why you believe that. Can you help me understand that? You know, you might have to get to that point where you're challenging it.
You don't have to put those lies in your story. They can tell you lies, but all you have
Exactly.
to say is, well, if they have to be in the story, sometimes as the editor, I'll just chop it way down. There's not getting a quote, and, you know, this is not how Mr. Trump sees it. Just for an example.
Yeah, and as a science journalist, one of the things you can do is back up your research, especially before the interview or even after, with academic research. There are studies, there are certain things where there is consensus, so you can bring that up, that, you know, everybody agrees that climate is changing. You know, there is so many studies, so much research, and follow it up with their response to that, so you can kind of use that academic research to hold that person accountable.
Although you do want to avoid you don't want to get into a back and forth too much. You don't want to turn it into your actual Thanksgiving debate. I've especially run into that with, you know, if I've had to interview someone like RFK Jr. about vaccines. I had to interview Bob Sears one time, he wrote a book called The Vaccine Book, which has a lot of poor information and misinformation in it. And we spent 2 hours talking, and you know, you have to prevent yourself from getting into a back and forth. Like, you're not there to have an internet debate with them, but you do have a responsibility to at least get them to try to support what they're saying in a way that's going to be acceptable to other people. Or, like Robin said, you don't need to put that information in the story.
Yeah, I'm asking this question on behalf of someone else who is writing about chronic pain and also suffers from chronic pain themselves. And so there are a number of questions that sort of spool out of that. The most, you know, obvious one is, to what extent do you disclose your own circumstances, you know, your own chronic pain to your source? and to your readers. And I think we could probably agree, I think that under most circumstances, that's okay, and that it's part of, your own experience informs your reporting, and that there's no reason, not to be candid about that. I guess. We'll see whether people agree. The more tricky part is, to what extent does your own prior experience with chronic pain or whatever it is render you unable to do a good piece of journalism about chronic pain? To what extent do your own circumstances, your own life story, render you either where it becomes inappropriate to disclose, either to sources or to readers, or number two, to the extent that it might make you inappropriate as the storyteller?
I rely on my editors for that. I'm in conversations about something very similar to that right now. Who has heard of Ozempic? Guess who pays $350 a month to Canada to buy Ozempic? Guess who's writing about obesity and Ozempic? I pitched a story to one of my editors about it, but I said in my article, I am taking this medication. I have been diagnosed with obesity. I have these metabolic factors. I also am very open about it on my Facebook, and my Facebook is a very fun place and has a lot of editors on there, and one of my editors, an editor at Slate actually, came to me and wanted me to write about it because of the fact, because it's Slate, that I have that personal experience. Slate's an appropriate place for that. But when I pitched it to my science news editor, I said, I don't know if you would feel as though this would compromise my ability to do this story. I am comfortable being transparent and including a note at the bottom that says this. It's up to you. And the initial response on that was that she thought, well, I think it's probably a better idea not to do that story because of that. And I said, okay, that's fine. And then later we came back and we were like, well, maybe we could cover this angle of it, especially if it came out after the Slate article, when it's easy for people to go back and find out that I am taking the medication that I'm writing about. So at the same time, the story's not about me, right? The story is about whatever the story's about. I mean, presumably it's not about me. And so you do need to make sure that you're cautious in writing the story. And again, sometimes I'll rely on an editor to kind of rein me in. Editors who've worked with me know that sometimes I need that. I'll ask my editor and be frank. I will trust them and say, am I too close to this story? Or am I, do you think it's appropriate for me to say this? Or do I need to talk to someone who feels this way about this that completely disagrees with me, and how should I do that? Or, or would you feel more comfortable if another journalist interviewed that person and we include their story and we collaborate with another journalist? It's going to depend on the circumstances, but I think you can trust your editors, or if it's a story you're going to pitch, trust your colleagues and seek out their input. But I think transparency is always paramount. I'm sort of a radically transparent person. Some people wish I was less transparent.
Yeah, I'm all for transparency, but I just want to throw out there that, until journalism started diversifying a great deal in the United States, there was no expectation of transparency. And there was no demand that we, notify or disclose anything about our biography to our editors. So I just want to sort of defend you from this incessant self-revelation that can be required in some cases, and this constant self-questioning that can occur to a detrimental extent sometimes. I mean, so many aspects of my biography could arguably be relevant to my reporting, and I kind of insist that I'm not going to get into that with my editors unless I'm really losing sleep over it.
I mean, the dark secret associated with that is that readers actually really tend to like it when we talk about ourselves and we confess our own connections, and editors know that readers like it, and editors encourage that. So it's not just about transparency. There are also market motives at play here.
I think, to support what you're saying, if I am interested in writing about sexual assault and I have been sexually assaulted, I have no obligation to tell my editor.
One in three women has been.
Yeah, so I think there are limits. In the case of the example I was giving with Ozempic, I was explicitly pitching a story on a medication I had just taken, and I'm paying a foreign government. I hope I won't get in trouble for this. No, I am paying for this out of pocket because I can't get access to it. And I was pitching a story about the inability for people to get access because of insurance not doing it. So in that case, I felt like it was very relevant because it was so tied to my personal circumstances. But certainly, when I write about abortion, there are reasons in my history, I have not had an abortion, but there are reasons in my history that I feel very strongly about the issue of abortion. I feel no obligation to tell my editors those things.
Thanks. Question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming in to talk about these topics. I think they're really important. On the note of like maintaining and building source relationships and keeping those boundaries pretty clear, I'm curious for beat reporting specifically, like as you interview the same person more and more, obviously you're gonna get like a little closer with them, not a friendship, but like more of a relationship. How do you deal with a situation where you might have to push them on something that you haven't in the past and you don't want to burn the relationship, but like you still want to remain critical with them? Does that make sense? Okay, great.
Well, I think it's again maintaining that professional boundary and professional tone in your interviews with your sources and as you're doing your interviews, so you don't come across as friends, as especially when you have to do several interviews, always reminding them that you're the journalist working on the story is eventually going to publish, this interaction is eventually going to come to an end. So I think clarifying, again, informing the source about the whole purpose of the interviews and conversations could be very helpful instead of chit-chatting, etc. That could make you feel like you get to a point where you can't ask the hard question. So again, saying that, I need to ask you this question because, again, this is what my editor needs, or this is what I need for the story. Some of the stories, you need to fact check things and you might need to tell your source, I'm going to ask you these questions and we're going to have the fact checking process. It's not that I don't trust you, but this is part of a process in our newsroom. Again, clarifying all these things with your sources can help you in the long run and also help you kind of not get into these quandaries.
Great answer. I mean, we're going to have difficult conversations even with the people we're really close with outside of journalism too. So these are really great skills. I mean, honestly, a lot of how I learned to be someone who can speak in public and have conversations was through learning how to interview sources. I really gained a lot of social skills in learning how to do interviews. So Naseem, I want to, while we have you here, you're such a great resource. Can you talk a little bit about how, before we end, how trauma, a little bit more about how it affects the brain and affects recall, affects how people talk about their experience, because I think a lot of us are not aware.
There are 3 great videos on a UK-based trauma and journalism organization called Headlines Network. I really recommend that you guys watch that, and it really explains in very short 2-minute videos how, when we are faced with a traumatic event, what is triggered in our brain and how it triggers certain hormones to be released in our bodies, which causes stress, the fight-flight mode that we always hear about, and how some of these situations kind of stay in a cycle, which could over a long term lead to conditions like we call post-traumatic stress disorder. But one of the things that we have learned and research has shown is that immediately, especially after a traumatic event, our memories are sort of fragmented. And, a lot of times some people can't verbalize what they witnessed. So or they might remember something that's completely inaccurate, but that's how their brain processed it. And in time, when things calm down, maybe the memories get a little more solid and become more clear. And that's why it's so important to check back with your sources in longer term stories, especially that you said such and such was wearing a blue shirt. Do you still remember it that way? And also talking to several sources to make sure you're getting all the facts correctly and not rely on one person's memory who has been in a traumatic event. And the whole concept of trauma is really, think about the level 1 trauma center that you have here. Trauma is the injury, is a severe injury. So when we talk about psychological trauma, it's like a, injury to your, it's like a severe injury to your psychological well-being. And it takes time to heal from that. and understanding that when people are in that mode where they have faced something where they have lost complete control and it's been unexpected, it will take time for them to come back to a normal level. And again, after these events, we still go out, we talk to people, and there are people who talk to us. And sometimes we need to do that during breaking news situations, and that's how the news works. But for you to be aware of these things, because when you're out there, you're gonna face people who are extremely angry. And you should realize that you shouldn't take that personally. Because, you know, when I was covering pulse mastering, I was very shocked. Why are people so angry and yelling at me? And it's just after this event. And when you have this knowledge, at least you are a little protective of yourself, and you know that you're doing your job, but you also understand how this awful event has affected these people. So again, I really recommend watching those videos on Headlines Network and checking out Dart Center to understand. You know, I'm not a medical professional, so I can't explain the medical way that things happen, but what we know is that trauma affects our brain. So try to remember that.
Right. Just the last thing I think we could touch on is just the extent to which people who we speak with, our sources, have had media training. And I think we've gotten lulled, I guess is the point I was trying to get at a little earlier, in science and health journalism, into thinking that a lot of our sources have media training. And that's because initially we weren't really, not so many decades ago, we didn't include a lot of patients. We didn't include a lot of non-professional voices in our stories, and we relied a lot on authorities. And a lot of them, especially in the last few decades, have had media training. I've worked at an institution where it was my job to do media training with the professors and academics who were working at that institution. So I think sometimes if we're doing study stories in science and health journalism or medical journalism, we can think, oh, everybody understands these rules. But I think we need to flip that. Is that your thinking? I mean, I'm starting to think, like, how few people really have had, you know, of all the sources we nowadays are going to likely include for a fair and balanced story in our pieces, what percentage of them have actually an understanding of how journalism works, what's going to happen in an interview, and what's fair to expect from an interview? And
even with scientists, it's vastly, there's a wide range of, I have interviewed scientists who have zero media training whatsoever. I've had to explain to scientists before how things work. I won't get too into the weeds here, but there's something called the Engelfinger rule, which preprints have kind of made moot to an extent, but where you're not allowed to have scientific findings that you're going to be publishing in a journal later, published ahead of time somewhere else. And I would go to a conference and they would have a poster and they would say, I can't talk to you because you can't write about my poster. And I'm like, actually I can. I have to explain to them that doesn't violate the Engelfinger rule, here's why. So yeah, I definitely think that we need to, and it's okay to ask questions like, have you spoken with a reporter before? I think it's okay to even ask a question like that. I will often give my sources tips either at the beginning or the end of an interview, depending on the situation. Like I've given interviews at the end of an interview. I've said before, listen, I would suggest from now on, whenever you talk to a reporter, always research the reporter before you agree to their interview. I've actually given that tip to other sources before. And part of it's because I want them to research me. I tell them, vet me, please. Go know who you're going to talk to so that you feel comfortable talking to me and you know who I am. But that's good practice anyway. You should always be doing that. So.
Do you have any thoughts on the extent to which there is media training among our sources and how we should be treating sources? I mean, even people who are professionals are, that line between, community member and professional or, expert is a little false, perhaps.
Yeah, I think if you're not sure if the source knows, just explain it to them. I was talking to a researcher not long ago, and she told me, she's like, this is my first time talking to a reporter. What should I expect? So you just take your time to explain to them not only the fact that your interview is going to be on the record, so whatever we're going to talking about I can use in the story, but if you need to go off the record, please let me know. And explaining all that to them, but also explaining how the story works, when the story is going to be published, how it's going to be published, where it's going to be, whether your news outlet allows them to view their quotes before publication or not, And you can always ask them, do you have any other questions for me? So, you know, just this, you're talking to another human being. Just be curious and open.
And remember that you are always an ambassador for your own profession, for better or for worse.
Excellent. Thanks so much for this conversation. I think it's been really interesting. I think we'll conclude.